Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones about how to make sure you're getting the information you need to do a good job on any work assignment. Your Law School Toolbox host is Alison Monahan, and normally I'm here with Lee Burgess. That's my co-host. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back. Today, we're talking with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones about how to be sure you're getting the information you need to do a good job on a work assignment, whatever type of assignment or job it is. Because this is something that you have seen a lot in your days as a recruiter, right? I mean, I would guess one of the main reasons someone doesn't get an offer is they screw up an assignment.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of this stuff is preventable.
Well, I hope almost all of it's preventable.
True.
All right, so I've gotten my dream job. I'm ready for my first assignment. Woohoo! I've got a meeting set up with my boss in an hour in their office. What's the number one thing I need to do to be sure that I'm successful with this assignment?
Bring a notepad and a pen.
Oh my gosh, totally. Yeah, this is the advice.
But it is key.
I think almost everything else really comes down to this. And this was the advice I got when I started my first job. I think a partner said, if you ever show up to my office without having a notepad and something to write with, I will fire you on the spot. And it was one of the, maybe it wasn't quite that harsh. He might have been joking. But I did remember it. And this is a huge, huge, huge pet peeve for lawyers because your time is really valuable. You're making a ton, people are paying a lot of money for your time. Literally hundreds or sometimes over $1,000 an hour. And you're giving an assignment to someone, and there's this moment of like, are you paying attention?
Yeah, I think really it doesn't matter that much what you write on that piece of paper.
Exactly.
It's really just a symbol that you're walking in, like ready to listen, ready to start this, and, interested, prepared, all of those things. Especially if you're new,
Yeah.
And they don't know you. Yeah.
Yeah, it just makes it looks really bad if you show up without something to write with and write on. And, sometimes people say, well, it's fine. I'll just get out my phone. Like, I have my phone with me. I can take notes on my phone. Don't do that.
Don't do that. Don't ever even take out your phone, please.
No, this is not a situation to have your phone out. And I know it might seem unfair because you might say, look, I'm not texting, I'm not emailing, I'm not on Tinder or whatever. I'm taking notes. That's just how I take notes. But that's not the way it's going to be perceived, particularly for the older generation of attorneys. They're going to think, who is this kid in my office texting while I'm trying to give him an assignment?
Exactly. I think, you may not write things most of the time, but this is a situation where you really need to. Also, for your sake, it is hard to sometimes focus because you probably will have things pop up on your phone. What if they see it? It's not worth the risk for you either.
No, it just makes you look distracted, even if you're really not distracted. I think the reality is, you can't really touch type on your phone and make eye contact. So, if I'm writing with a pen, I can be looking up occasionally, looking down, looking up, making eye contact. If I'm on my phone, I have to constantly be looking at the keyboard. I'm not going to get anything coherent. So that's another issue is, you're not as engaged in the meeting because you're really focused on this phone that, as you say, could be popping up like all kinds of crazy things. You're like, oh my gosh, did you hear? Like they just, whatever, like New York Times news alert, not the time or place for it.
Well, and I think actually in this kind of situation, it may be better to leave your phone completely in your office somewhere else because I find that you can even be distracted, like thinking about your phone in your pocket.
Right. Buzzes.
So my advice would be, maybe don't bring it. You can manage to, live a few minutes without your phone.
It sounds crazy, but you can actually survive a 20-minute meeting without your phone on your person.
Yeah. So, I think these are key to getting any assignment.
Yeah, because I think a key thing is here to understand you're walking into the situation where you're probably going to be nervous. I mean, as you probably should be nervous. It's a new situation. You've got to try to stay focused and make sure you're getting the information that you're going to need to do this assignment well. And a lot of the times, you're coming into the middle of something. You know, this is probably not the first day that the person giving you this assignment has worked on this case or this deal or whatever it is. So they might have been working on this literally in some cases for years. So here you are, you're coming into this situation. They have some very specific thing they want you to do. They're probably not giving you all of the context. You probably don't really have practical experience to actually understand what you're being asked to do. So this can be really tricky. And I think, you know, having that notepad that you're writing on, trying to stay focused is step one, but there's a lot of other stuff to talk about too, right?
Yes, and I would also say with the staying focused, what you should remember is this is like a really important time for you because you don't know how much you're going to be able to ask follow-up questions and go back to them. And so you probably will, and there'll be things, but I think you have to consider this really important that you get whatever you can out of this meeting, especially if it's, a senior partner. This is important for you to really get the information you need.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this meeting, even if it's 10 minutes, is really going to set you up for succeeding on this assignment or having a complete and total disaster on your hands. Yes. And having a disaster on your hands is not a good way to get the job offer later.
Yeah, and I think you also have to remember that anyone you work with on an assignment is going to have an opportunity to review you in writing. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, at most firms, anywhere I've ever worked. So
well, I think this is not just firms. I mean, imagine that you're working in a public interest organization. These people might not have a job to offer you at the end, but they're going to be absolutely critical references for you. And if somebody's not willing to do a good reference letter or be a good reference in person for you, that's going to be a really serious problem.
So really, I think I just mean that anyone that you even have a little contact with, has a say in all of this. So you should treat everybody on the assignment, like they're reviewing you.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And if things go badly wrong and, somebody's deconstructing the situation, well, how did this happen? And they go and talk to the person who gave you the assignment, like, well, I don't know. It didn't even seem to be listening to me. They were sitting there on their phone the whole time. Doesn't make you look good.
Yeah. And I've actually had partners call me after a meeting with somebody and tell me that they, for example, had their phone out and they were really concerned.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think some of this is probably generational, but you do need to realize that the people you're working with and the people who are paying you and the people who are evaluating you are in a different, sort of cohort than you are, and they have different expectations, particularly around things like technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's go back to our meeting. I've walked in. I'm a little nervous. Okay, so like we said, got to take notes. Not just because it makes you look engaged, but because you're probably going to need to reference these later. So, you're not just doing this because it makes you look like a good employee. You're actually trying to write down things, particularly key terms or key legal terms, even if you're not exactly sure what they mean. So, say you have not taken evidence and someone asks you to write or draft a motion in limine. You may not exactly remember what that is, or you might not exactly know what that is, but you probably should know that that's a legal term of art that you need to write down. And I think it's tricky whether you want to ask directly if you're not sure what something is. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think sometimes you have to sort of see who your audience is. Mm-hmm. So some of it's sort of common sense. Do you think this person really wants to answer these questions for you? Do they seem like they're going to, be open to that? I think, and some of it might depend on their level too. Like you may not feel as comfortable with a senior partner doing it. Right. Or for example, let's say that you're getting your first assignment from your mentor or something like that. Like in that situation, I could imagine, maybe you could do that. But I think as long as you picked up what it was, I think it's totally fine to look it up later.
Yeah, I think it's a fine line. If it's something you feel like you probably ought to know what they're talking about, then you just write it down and you go and look it up, Black's Law Dictionary to get started. If it's something that you get the sense like you shouldn't really be expected to know what it is, I think it's fine to ask a few clarifying questions, but it's a fine line because this person obviously has a lot more information and they may not be thinking, oh, this, person who's never worked in a legal job before doesn't really know what discovery responses look like. Okay, fine, but like you can figure that out.
Yeah, and I think, figure out, is it really specific to this assignment?
Yeah.
Like, is it something that isn't just a general term, but is something you need to know for this? Maybe it's okay. But yeah, I think, it's kind of a common sense thing at this point.
Right. Well, common sense is the least common thing, right?
Yeah.
And so it's likely, assuming this person isn't totally out of touch with how people work, it's likely that they're going to be giving you some background or context of the actual situation itself. So they tell you to write your motion in limine, but they're not just going to leave you there. You're probably going to get some background on the case this case would be a case, could be a deal. And here, sometimes people just give you the background sort of FYI, so you have some context. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they do it because it's really important. So I think in this case, it's actually totally fair to ask how important the background information is. So, for example, is this background just for my information or is it something I should be writing down in detail? And most likely they go, oh, no, you don't need to know the details. This is really just so you understand the basic context. If they don't give you any sort of context, I think it's fair to ask too, hey, could you give me like a couple minute recap of the situation so I understand where we're at? And or is there a document maybe from the beginning of the case or the beginning of the deal, a document I can look at for some context? I think most people at that point will say, oh yeah, of course, you probably do need to know that, right?
Or I would imagine maybe it's a partner who says, oh, you can talk to this associate who's been on the case to give you more background or something like that. Know who else is involved.
Exactly. Is this something that firms sort of coach partners particularly on at all, or are they just kind of left to their own devices?
We try. I will say, I would talk to partners about things like that. And also, especially with summer associates, remind them that this person may have never done anything like this before. So think about that going into it, because I think some partners come into it like everyone's, has the same experience and knows what they're talking about and that sort of thing.
Right. So everyone's worked on this case. Everyone's worked on this case for 2 years and has 20 years of experience litigating. It's like, no, that's not really the case.
So I also wouldn't take most of it too personally because I doubt, however they do things is really specific to you, how they're saying it or that sort of thing or their tone.
No, the reality is some people are much better at this than other people. And if you happen to get that person who really sucks at it, I think the key thing is really trying to get information on who else you can go to when you realize you have no idea what you're actually being asked to do.
Yeah, and I think usually there is somebody else.
Yeah, and so that's something we'll talk about in a few minutes. But all right, so basically, we've got our notes. We're looking at some background. One of the really key things that I always liked when someone did when I was giving them assignments is to repeat back to me their understanding of what I'm asking them to do. So, something like, okay, so just to be sure I'm clear, you're asking me to draft discovery responses on behalf of our client, including interrogatory responses and requests for admission. And at that point, either I'm like, yes, you understand it perfectly, or no, you're not doing the interrogatory responses. You're only doing the requests for admissions. How did you miss that? But you want to clarify that in the office.
Well, and I think making a mistake in that situation, like, no, you missed the whole point of what I was saying, is a lot better than doing all the work and coming out with the total wrong thing. And I also think just repeating things back makes them know that you heard them.
Right. Exactly.
It's like when you meet someone and you're told to repeat their name. I think it helps to do it and then make sure. It also just like gives you a check on you were listening.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes people are really unclear on what they're actually asking you to do. They might give you a bunch of background and they say, oh, we need to do this memo. And it's like, okay, so are you asking me to write the memo? Are you asking me to do research for the memo? Or are you asking me to do a portion of the memo? Like, what am I doing here? That's a question you need to answer before you leave the office. What am I being asked to do personally? What am I responsible for?
Well, and I think that goes along with that is also how much time should it take?
Sure, absolutely.
Is a really key thing, because I think that is something where you can get into trouble from the beginning and, it can kind of spin out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think time has two aspects here. One is you want to be sure you clarify any sort of due dates. So the final due date, intermediate due dates, those are absolutely critical. So for example, as I understand it, we need to file these on June 10th and I need to have a draft to you by June 5th. Is that correct? So it's not just like, oh, we're going to file them on June 10th. Presumably there's some intermediate deadline you've talked about. Make sure you know what that is. But then also the question of how much time should I be spending on this? Is this a 3-hour project or is this a 2-week project?
Right. Well, and also, should I check back in when it gets to this, at some point? I mean, maybe it's not even necessarily a question you probably should check back in if you feel like it's taking a really long time or you have to go down a different path, and you're not really sure if you should. But I think all of that stuff is important. And then also with the due dates, I've seen a lot of, especially summer associates, get into trouble because they're told there is no due date.
That's a fun one.
Yeah, and the person even says it to them, and it's like, we'll just need it by the end of the summer. We found a lot of pro bono assignments actually, fit into that because a lot of times there are places that'll give specific work with different firms over the summer. Mm-hmm. But they actually do want the answers to these questions and they're real assignments. But it's sort of like they just say, oh, it needs to be at the end. I think it's really dangerous. So if you're not given a due date, give yourself a due date. Make sure that you have an intermediate due date for yourself, because I actually think that the assignments that people have the most trouble with are the big, long ones that seem sort of, whenever.
Right, exactly. Or, we just need, we're going to write an article on this for the fall for our client newsletter. We just need someone to do some research. Because it's really easy to push that aside. And that's another one of those dangerous ones where it's like, okay, how much time are you thinking I should spend on this?
Yeah.
You probably, in that situation, if it's just research for an article, they're probably not thinking you're going to work full time on this for like 4 weeks. It's probably a much more limited scope. And there are other things that you could probably be doing in that other time. But yeah, I think if you get this sort of amorphous assignment that they're just kind of giving to you, you definitely want to try to add some more structure to it. And, you might even, once you've had time to go back and think about it, sort of present a schedule like, my goal is to do the initial research for this in the next 2 weeks. I'll send that to you. You can take a look at it. I mean, they can look at it or not look at it, but at least they have it.
I think that's such a good idea, because I know the other thing I noticed is that especially the partners would say, oh yeah, I didn't give them a due date, but obviously I expected it, blah, blah, blah.
Nice.
Well, and it's like, well, one, that's ridiculous, because how would they know to read your mind? But second of all, it's like, it is understandable that it's, they didn't want to get it this day before the person was leaving and then not have any time to look at it or whatever. So I think all that stuff, should be clarified, and maybe even talking to someone who's more junior, who's worked with them, like what are their expectations generally about these sort of things?
Right. Because if someone says, this is a slow burn project, that doesn't mean you can ignore it.
Right.
I mean, you need to be working on it.
Thing for everybody, right? Like some people think, a lot of time is a week, and some people think a lot of time is a month. So
right, or a lot of time is like 2 hours.
Right. Good point.
So I think trying to, and the good thing about trying to set those initial deadlines and make them clear is that then the person can come back to you and be like, 2 weeks? No, I want this in like 3 days, and then at least you're not sitting there weeks from now with a person fuming in their office that they aren't getting these notes that they need to write their very important article.
Well, and the other thing about the time is that you need an idea, because you need to know what other assignments you're taking on. And it's on you to balance that kind of stuff a lot of the time. So you really need to know that you can handle what what's on your plate.
Right. And you may not have an idea until you start, particularly if it's a research assignment. You're typically not really going to have that much of an idea how long this is going to take until you figure out how difficult it is. And you can't know that until you start the research. So, sometimes you're like, oh, I can just look this up. But probably if they're writing an article or, drafting something for a client, that's probably not really the case that you can just go look it up. Like there's probably some ambiguity here, or otherwise they would have just, copied off those pages in the book and sent them off.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
On that point, I think another really critical question that people often don't think about because it's just not something you've had to think about is what kind of legal research you're allowed to do. Because the reality is you may not know this if you have not worked outside of the school environment, but these databases are really, really expensive, or they can be. And there's always that person who accidentally spends like $20,000 on Westlaw or Lexis or something for a pro bono case because they don't understand how to do legal research effectively. Do not be that person.
Yeah, you don't want to stand out for something like that.
No, I mean, because like somebody's going to get a call being like, did you assign this person this task? Like they just spent $30,000 in 2 hours. It's awkward.
And I think you'd be in a situation, right, in both ways. If it was a client assignment and you spent way too much on it, there'd be an issue billing the client. If it's a pro bono assignment, it's the firm paying for it and they're upset too. It's like you really need to have a handle on all this because this is real money.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing that if you've only done this in the academic setting, you don't realize like someone is actually paying for this. And, you probably had some intro class at the beginning of your time at this job where, you probably sat half asleep through the rep lecturing you about how to use cost-effective research tools. You need to pay attention to that. And if you don't understand it or you're not sure what type of queries you can be running or how to, save the query and run stuff within it, that's the time to get on the phone with the actual company because they have people who can help you and can tell you, okay, don't rerun this query. Like this is very expensive. There are other things we can do.
Yeah, I think you need to know where to go for help and use resources to make sure that you're doing things, efficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the next key thing I want to talk about. Any type of assignment, you have to be careful about who you're getting help from. And almost certainly you're going to need some help, even if it's just a sanity check to make sure that A, you understand what you're being asked to do, B, that you have the resources you need, and C, you're not totally screwing it up. But the person who gave you the assignment oftentimes will not be the person that you immediately go back to with questions.
Correct.
So, if it's like the managing partner of the firm took 10 minutes out of their day to give you this assignment, you don't call them up to be like, well, I found this case, but I'm not really sure it applies. Can you give me like an idea for a different query? They're going to be like, why are you wasting my time with this?
And I think this is a case where there's all these people that you need to, be on your side and help you with these things. And a lot of junior associates, summer associates don't realize who those people are and why they can be really helpful.
Oh, for sure. So who would some of those people be?
The paralegals.
Massively underused resource.
Yeah, and I think, I know lots of junior associates would say they know way more than I do. They've been here for 30 years. They know how to do all of this.
They know everything. They typically are the people who carry a lot of the background of the case. If you have a question about who someone is or how they relate, they're going to know that because they are the closest to a lot of those documents. Right.
And I mean, obviously you can go to other associates, who are maybe closer to your level in the situation. But even that, I think it depends on the person about how much time they're going to spend with you.
Right. How many other things they have to do.
Yeah. So make sure when you go, really to anyone, you know what you're asking. You put it all together into one meeting. I know that people would get really annoyed, especially let's say with emails, if you're sending 10 separate emails about all these questions, put it together.
The same head with the one that always killed me is when they didn't change the subject line and you would just get a huge chain and it would be a question and then someone would respond to the question and then they would ask another question that had nothing to do with the subject line. And so then when you're going back trying to answer this question, you're like, what? How was this even sent to me? That is not good email practice.
I think some people don't even realize you can change the subject line, even in the same chain.
You can.
Go in and delete it, even if it was a chain with a different subject line before. So it should be specific. But I would say, really think about it. Think about all your questions. Obviously, some other ones might come up, but you should try to reduce that as much as possible. People don't like you wasting their time for things that, aren't really necessary. So also know the questions that like you can go to your secretary for versus you need to go to the associate for.
Right. Like your secretary, for example, can answer a question on how to e-file something.
Yeah.
You don't need to ask like the more senior associate or the person above you or your boss, like, oh, so how do we attach a document if we're e-filing in like the Southern District? It's just like, okay, ask your secretary. This is the person who deals with this every day. And half the time the person will be like, I don't even know. Like, I don't deal with this.
Yeah, because they're just doing the same thing.
Yeah,
secretary.
I mean, God forbid, like you had to actually physically file something yourself. It'd be like, whoa. I mean, I don't know how to. Like, what are we uploading here? Like, which boxes do we check? I don't know.
But the thing that you really need to ask the associate or the partner, and really you should from the beginning, is what is the client matter number?
Oh, God, yes, please.
That can be a disaster if you've been working on this for a while, or really at all, because you need it for everything. You need it to save documents. You probably need it if you're making photocopies, like all sorts of things.
Yeah, this is one of those...
your time goes.
This is definitely one of those things that you ask about in the initial meeting and you write down on your piece of paper and then you put it on a Post-it note and you put it beside of your computer because you're going to need it like 18 times a day.
And if they say they don't know or there hasn't been one assigned at the beginning, it is your responsibility to follow up and make sure that you get it. It's your responsibility.
Yeah, I think sometimes people who are new to practice don't realize the importance of these type of details, but this is the way that you keep everything together on this case. So, in your document management system, there's going to be a number at the bottom of the document. It's probably going to incorporate that client matter number. Like this is how you bill your time. Like this is how you access a bunch of different stuff. And if you don't have that, or if you, God forbid, get it wrong, things are going to be ugly.
Yeah, I mean, if you get it wrong, the wrong people could open the document. It could completely get lost and no one knows where it is. Like all sorts of sort of nightmare scenarios.
Yeah, particularly if you're working there for the summer, you don't want to get a call in October being like, we really need this thing you worked on and no one can find it. And it turns out that you filed it under the wrong matter number and no one can ever find it. It's not good.
Well, and I think something to keep in mind for especially summer associates is I think sometimes they sort of view some of these assignments like they view their schoolwork, which is just, it's something for me to do. But pretty much all of your work is going to be a real thing that somebody is really going to use and need for a case. And so, this isn't just theoretical.
Right, exactly. That was impressed upon me. One of the first assignments I got after my 1L summer, where somebody called me into their office and they're like, I'm on a deadline. I have this contracts question. I really need an answer to it. Do you know have you ever heard of Corbin on contracts? And I'm like, not really. He's like, okay, taking you to the library, went to the library, found the book. He's like, look in this book, find the answer. And so, he's like, you have an hour. He's like, I'm on a hard deadline. So I have an hour, I do the research, I send him the answer, and he calls me back a few minutes later and he says, okay, how sure are you that this is right? And I'm like, well, I'm basically a 1L, but given that, I'm pretty sure. And why? He says, because I don't have time to review the answer and I'm getting ready to file it.
Oh my gosh.
It turned out in the end, he did actually take a step back and realize this was pretty stupid and he did review it and it was correct. But I didn't know that. If I just dialed it in, he actually could have filed whatever he was filing with incorrect information because I just was like, oh, well, I don't know. It seems kind of right to me.
Well, I know that we did have a situation where a summer associate was writing a really small section of something and no one did check it and there was a mistake or a typo or something like that and they saw it later and the person's response was like, oh, well, I didn't think that I was going to be the final say in this.
That cannot be your mindset. You have to assume you were the last person who was going to see this before it goes to the court or to whoever it's going to. You have to, you cannot think like that.
It was bad.
Well, that's also a terrible reason.
Yeah, I know. But I think it's an example of they didn't understand the real world, what they're doing, which is also clients are actually paying for your time. They might not be paying for all your time, but they are actually paying probably hundreds of dollars an hour for you to do this stuff.
Oh, yeah. I wrote an amicus brief to the Second Circuit basically by myself.
wow.
Yeah. I mean, it's you start to realize pretty quickly, like, oh, this is real.
Yeah.
Um,
So you shouldn't be turning anything in that you like. Don't even say draft or whatever. Like that. Just I feel like that makes them think you didn't take it seriously.
yeah. Any work product that you submit to anyone should always be as absolutely perfect as you can make it. And maybe at that time there are questions that need to be answered or something like that, and that's fine. But it shouldn't look like a draft. It should look like something that basically could be sent off with just a few changes or pieces of input.
And there's another example of you should know what the formatting is, or if anything, it should look like, whatever document it's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
So if you're not sure, you ask the right person.
And almost always there are going to be templates or some type of samples at the firm or at whatever your organization is. It is highly likely that you are not the first person who has ever filed discovery responses, for example. So ask for these. Ask for them either in the initial meeting or in the follow-up where you're talking to the person, that you've been told you can talk with. Do we have a template that would you use for these? Can I see it? That's a good place to start. Because again, like a lot of it's about time. Like you don't want to be wasting time figuring out the formatting of a discovery response. That's just silly.
Well, and I think a lot of people get into trouble because they're not sure about something and they sort of spin out on worrying about it, not trying to do it and try to figure it out. And it's like, if you just put it into a question for somebody, or kind of ask somebody to point you in the right direction of who to ask even, you just save yourself a lot of trouble and, anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also asking for resources for legal research can be helpful. Is there a horn book that you think I should start with? I might not think to tell someone that if I'm giving them an assignment about patent law because I know that you always use Chisholm on patents, but they don't know that. So if they ask me that, of course, I'm going to think, oh, yeah, of course, this is the one you should use. But somebody has to tell you that. And that's a completely fair point. In that case, a reasonable person who's giving the assignment would think, oh, gosh, I really should have mentioned this. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would be annoyed at you for asking a good question or asking,
No, I mean, the worst they're going to say is, oh, I don't really know. Like, talk to so-and-so about that.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so let's talk briefly about a few places where things commonly go wrong.
Okay.
I think the number one, we've covered this a lot, is just not listening or recording the relevant information. So something might seem obvious to the person who's giving you the assignment. You don't realize the importance of it. This is why it's so important to really parrot back to them in the meeting and or in a follow-up email clarifying, okay, so that was, really enjoyed meeting with you. Here's my understanding of what I'm being asked to do. Here's my understanding of the deadlines. Let me know if any of that doesn't seem right to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Write it down, make sure that you're clear, make sure that you know, where you're starting.
Yeah, and also that creates a paper trail so that then if in the end they're like, that's not what I asked you to do, you have the email where you're like, well, I did ask you if this is what you asked for, and you said yes. So, not really my fault.
Good point.
CYA.
Yeah.
Oh, this is very litigation specific, but it is a huge pet peeve, and it also happens absolutely all the time with people who are just starting out. Make sure you understand which type of cases you are researching. So, for example, if your case is in federal court on a federal question, you're probably not researching state law cases. I mean, this may not always be true. Remember your Erie from Civ Pro, but basically, if I give you an assignment that's like, we need a case that says this, and we're in federal court in Delaware, and you come back with a state case in Delaware that you spent 6 hours finding and you're really proud of yourself, my response is not going to be a good one. You need to keep this in mind. And if you're not sure, again, ask.
Yeah, and you should keep that in mind going into it, that that's something you need to clarify.
Yeah, it's something to be thinking about. Always, always, always. I know it's easy to think maybe you didn't cover it in Civ Pro or just that was an area you didn't like, but you have to be thinking about these things because they actually matter. Because if you find a useless case, it's okay, great, you just wasted everyone's time and now we're a day behind. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, and I think you mentioned this, once you have whatever your assignment is, do not procrastinate.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think this is probably the number one issue where I saw someone really like get sunk on something was this issue about time, and especially for the longer assignments.
Yeah, and the reality is, again, like you're not going to really understand the assignment until you get into it. So, it's oftentimes you get the assignment and then you go to a nice lunch and then maybe there's an event and you're thinking, oh, I'll get started on that tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes and then the next day comes and suddenly, the rest of the summer is gone and you still haven't started. Whatever it takes to make you start something, whether it's, finding another person who could be your accountability partner or setting deadlines or whatever, you're a professional. Act like one.
Yeah, and I think, what no one wants to hear? Like, let's say that it was something that was long-term and it's getting towards the end and they ask you where it is and it's like, oh, well, I'm working on someone else's assignment, that has like a stricter deadline. No one wants to hear that, like, you thought the other thing was more important or you don't have time for their thing, even if their thing were longer term.
Right.
So you need to be able to manage these things as they go. So I agree, getting started, even with a longer assignment, like earlier, so you have an idea of what it's going to take, is a good idea. And always having these interim deadlines. So I know from the firm side, I think that people are encouraged to give, especially junior people, interim deadlines, but not everyone's going to do that.
Yeah,
it doesn't occur to them.
No, or they just, let's face it, most lawyers are not great managers because they're not business people. They're lawyers. So
it's really on you. Like, it's going to come back to hurt you, if you can't get it done. And the absolute worst thing to do is to leave a summer associate job where you didn't finish something, especially that you could have.
Right, and you can't expect that this person who gave you the assignment is going to be checking back in with you. That's not their responsibility. It's your responsibility to make sure you get your work done. And if you have that expectation that, somebody's going to be hovering over you saying, oh, just want to check in, we got that deadline tomorrow, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, definitely. And I think they're just going to expect it.
Yeah, well, why not? It's like you gave the person the assignment. Aren't they working on it?
Yeah.
That would be my expectation. I'm like, I don't have time to deal with this. Like, I have 17 other things to do. I'm going to trial. And it's not, it's not anything personal. It's not like I hate the person or I don't care about this person. It's just like, people do not have time.
Well, and even though they may not give you a set deadline, they probably want it with enough time to like make revisions and things like that. So you never want to be, somebody else might be last minute, the person you're giving it to, but that shouldn't be your approach, because also you're giving it to them, in the final format that you feel, and that's fine. But, most likely you will have to do more work on it. So leave time for that.
Yeah, and they may sit on it, but that's their problem, not yours.
Exactly. Then it's like you did everything that you could do.
Yeah, and you could follow up and say, hey, just wanted to check in and see if you have any thoughts on this. Again, create a paper trail. Mm-hmm. All right, well, we are out of time, speaking of time, but I think my final takeaway is nobody expects you to be immediately perfect at a summer job, but you want to appear competent, you want it to seem like you're making an effort, and you want to seem like a person who can manage their time. So if you do those things, even if the outcome maybe isn't perfect, I think people will generally respect that and think, oh, this person, I liked them, they worked hard. But if you're not behaving like that, then you're not going to get a lot of leeway.
Yeah. And my big takeaway would be, use the resources that you have there. Like talk to the paralegals, your legal secretary, other associates, and use that to help you do the best you can.
Yeah, exactly. And those resources, as you learn to use them, will help you for everything. So that's great. Once I found out there were books about contracts, it really opened my eyes to a lot of horn books, and law school got a lot easier. I was like, oh, you can just go look up the law? This is amazing. They never tell you this.
Good point. It can help you in other situations.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app because we'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. And if you'd like some career help, look at careerdicta.com, our career-related website, where we'll also help you one-on-one. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.